Hello everyone, welcome back to Ways of the World, a brief global history with sources. As we continue our study of Atlantic revolutions, global echoes, today we're going to focus on the echoes of revolution. And we're going to start with the abolition of slavery. Slavery was largely ended around the world between 1780 and 1890. Enlightenment thinkers were increasingly critical of slavery. The American and French revolutions focused attention on slaves' lack of liberty and equality. Religious groups, especially Quakers and Protestant evangelicals, became increasingly vocal in opposition to slavery. A growing belief that slavery wasn't necessary for economic progress became the focus. And the three major slave rebellions in the British West Indies showed that slaves were discontent. Brutality of suppression appalled a lot of people. And the abolitionist movements were most powerful in Britain. In 1807, Britain forbade the sale of slaves within its empire. 1834, Britain emancipated all slaves. Other nations followed suit over the next 50 years under growing international pressure. Most Latin American countries abolished slavery by the 1850s. Brazil was the last to do so by 1888. And Russian serfs were emancipated in 1861. There's resistance to abolition that was vehement among interested parties, and abolition often didn't lead to the expected results. Usually there was a little improvement in the economic lives of former slaves. The unwillingness of former slaves to work on plantations led to a new wave of global migration, especially from India and China. Few of those newly freed gained anything like political equality. Most former Russian serfs remained impoverished. More slaves were used within Africa to produce export crops. And in the Islamic world, slavery persisted, but freeing slaves was encouraged. All right, abolitionism. So this unusual late 18th century abolitionist image depicts an enslaved African in chains on the deck of a ship holding a knife. Unlike most abolitionist representations of Africans, which show their subjects kneeling, praying, or pleading, the subject of this engraving strikes a defiant pose as he seemingly contemplates suicide or perhaps resistance rather than captivity. So how did the slave resistance, such as the Great Jamaica Revolt, impact the representation of slaves in abolitionist imagery? This imagining of a slave revolt depicts a noble slave discontented with his status, resisting his social condition. Abolitionists use images like these to depict the Great Jamaica Revolt within the same framework and terminology of Enlightenment ideals that catalyzed the American and French revolutions. So how did the end of slavery transform the lives of the former slaves? In most cases, the economic lives of the former slaves did not improve dramatically. Outside of Haiti, newly freed people did not achieve anything close to political equality. And the greatest change was the former slaves were now legally free. Nations and nationalism. So revolutionary movements gave new prominence to a more recent kind of human community, the nation. The idea existed that humans are divided into separate nations, each with a distinct culture and territory, and deserving an independent political life. Before the 19th century, foreign rule in itself wasn't regarded as heinous or strange. The most important loyalties were to the clan, the village, or the region. But independence movements acted in the same new nations. Older identities and loyalties eroded. Science weakened the hold of religion. Migration to cities or abroad weakened local allegiances, and printing standardized languages. Nationalism was often presented as a reawakening of older cultural identities. Nationalism was enormously powerful in the 19th century. It inspired political unification of Germany and Italy, which offsets the balance of power in Europe. It inspired separatist movements by Greeks, Serbs, Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, Ukrainians, the Irish, and even Jews. And it fueled pre-existing rivalries among European states. And there are new efforts to instill national loyalty in citizens. And nationalism took on a variety of political ideologies. Quote-unquote civic nationalism identified the, quote, nation with a particular territory and encouraged assimilation. Some defined the nation in racial terms, for example, Germany. And nationalism was not limited to Europe. So let's look at the nations and empires of Europe circa 1880. So by the end of the 19th century, the national principle had substantially reshaped the map of Europe, especially in the unification of Germany and Italy. However, several major empires remained, each with numerous subject peoples who likewise sought national independence. So, in which regions of Europe were empires most prominent? Where were nation-states most prominent? Well, empires were most prominent in Eastern Europe, specifically the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian empires. Western Europe was primarily composed of nation-states. So, if you remember, we looked at a map of Napoleon and his empire. And if you think about that map and the one that you see here, what changed on the political map here of Europe after the collapse of Napoleon's empire? Is there anything that stayed the same? Well, Western, with the exception of the emergence of Belgium, largely stayed the same. Central Europe was politically reconfigured under the Austro-Hungarian Empire and a larger Germany. To the south, Italy was unified. To the north, Denmark separated from Norway, which itself was united with Sweden. So to the east, Poland was divided among Germany and the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. And many new nations emerged in the Balkans and territories formerly held by the Ottoman and Russian empires' acquisition of Poland. All right, nationalism in Poland. In the 18th century, Poland had been divided among Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and disappeared as a separate and independent state. Polish nationalism found expression in the 19th century in a series of revolts against Poland's Russian occupiers. This painting shows Russian officers surrendering their standards to Polish insurgents during the November uprising of 1830. The revolt was subsequently crushed, and Poland regained its independence as a nation-state only in 1918 at the end of World War I. So how were images such as the one shown used to promote nationalism? This image depicts the Nationalist Army of Poland to the left receiving the surrender of Imperial Russian forces to the right. Such images symbolically depict the decline of empires in the face of rising nations and are used to encourage others to join a glorious and, according to the image, winnable cause. Okay, feminist beginnings. So a feminist movement developed in the 19th century, especially in Europe and North America. European Enlightenment thinkers sometimes challenged the idea that women were innately inferior. During the French Revolution, some women argued that liberty and equality must include women. Middle-class women found more educational opportunities and less household drudgery. They increasingly joined temperance movements, charities, abolitionist movements, missionary work, and socialist and pacifist organizations. The first organized expression of feminism took place at a women's rights conference in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. The feminist movement was transatlantic from the beginning. By the 1870s, movements focused above all on suffrage. Movements included the middle class, not just the elite. Most worked through peaceful protest and persuasion. The women's movement became a mass movement in most industrialized countries by the turn of the century. Now, by 1900, the movement had several effects. Some upper and middle class women had been admitted to universities. Women's literacy rates were rising. Some U.S. states passed laws allowing women to control their property and wages. Some areas liberalized divorce laws. Some women made their way into new professions. In 1893, New Zealand became the first country to grant universal female suffrage. And the movement led to the discussion of the role of women in modern society. Taboo sexual topics were aired. Deep debates over women's proper roles took place. And maternal feminism argued for women's distinctive role as mothers. Also, there's bitter opposition to the movement. Some argued that strains of education and life beyond the home would cause reproductive damage. Some saw suffragists as a quote-unquote foreign body in national life. And feminism spread beyond Western Europe and North America, but less widely than nationalism, for example. All right, women's suffrage. So it began as a few isolated voices of feminist protests in the early 19th century, had become, by the end of the century, a mass movement in the United States and Western Europe. Here, in a photograph of an American suffrage parade in 1912, is an illustration of that movement in action. So based on the image, what social classes were most prominent in the suffrage movement? What evidence can you find regarding the social status of these protesters? Well, the feminist movement was primarily a middle and upper class movement, founded and embraced by women who had the time and the education to form and maintain a broad-based transatlantic movement. Such classes were or are represented in this image. Women are well-dressed, focused on middle-class ideas like suffrage, as opposed to issues like poverty or workers' rights, on which a working-class woman would focus. And it demonstrates that they can still maintain their domestic roles by bringing their children to the march. All right, Kartini. So the ideas of the European Enlightenment and Atlantic revolutions resonated deeply in the life of a remarkable young Javanese woman named Kartini during the late 19th century, when her country was part of the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. Born in 1879 into a large aristocratic Javanese family, young Kartini attended a Dutch elementary school where she learned the Dutch language and observed the relative freedom of her European classmates, in sharp contrast to the constraints and ritualized interactions of her own family. At the age of 12, in keeping with Javanese Muslim customs, Kartini was abruptly removed from her school, and for the next 4 years, she never left her home. Through her father, a high official in the Dutch colonial administration who much admired Western education, Kartini still had access to Dutch books, and later she was tutored by several Europeans, including one woman with strong socialist and feminist leanings. She also read widely on her own and began an extensive correspondence, largely with Dutch friends in the Netherlands, that lasted until her death. By the time she was 20, Kartini had acquired an impressive Western education and a network of relationships with prominent Europeans, both in the Netherlands and in Java. From her letters, we learned something of Kartini's thinking. In light of her exposure to Europeans and European thought, she found the absolute insubordination of Javanese women completely unacceptable. The seclusion of girls, the total separation of the classes, the absence of educational opportunities, all this drove her almost to despair. Quote, "Are fine women of no use to civilization?" End quote, she asked. But it was the prospect of a traditional high-class Javanese marriage that she found most appalling. Her husband would be, quote, "a stranger, an unknown man, whom my parents would choose for me, without my knowledge," end quote. During the wedding ceremony, she would be expected to prostrate herself before the bridegroom and kiss his feet as a sign of her future submission. Even then, she would be only one of several wives. Quote, "Do you understand now?" End quote, she wrote to a Dutch confidant. Quote, "the deep aversion I have for marriage," end quote. Kartini was equally outraged by particular features of Dutch colonial rule, especially its racism. Conscious of her membership in a, quote, "despised brown race," end quote, she deplored the need for, quote, "creeping in the dust," end quote, before Europeans. Javanese generally were not supposed to speak Dutch with their colonial masters, as if, quote, "Dutch is too beautiful to be spoken by a brown mouth," end quote. And yet for Kartini, it was Dutch education and its universal Enlightenment values, quote, "freedom, equality, fraternity," end quote, as she put it, echoing the slogan of the French Revolution, that would lead to Javanese emancipation from both Dutch and Javanese oppression. Quote, "Europe will teach us to be truly free," end quote, she wrote. Nonetheless, Kartini openly embraced much of her own culture, its art, music, poetry, its regard for the dead, hospitality to the poor, its spiritual depth, and she certainly did not seek to transform Javanese into, quote, "half Europeans," end quote, but she did believe that, quote, "contact with another civilization," end quote, and modern European education in particular would enable Javanese, quote, "to develop in the fine qualities that are peculiar to their race," end quote. Quote, "emancipation is in the air," end quote, she declared in early 1901. Kartini's fondest hope was to contribute to that emancipation by studying in the Netherlands and then opening a school for girls in Java. But these grand dreams were thwarted by opposition from her own family, from Javanese officials, and from much of the Dutch colonial bureaucracy. Java's leading newspaper denounced her intentions as, quote, "outrageous," end quote, and local gossip had it that she simply wanted to marry a European and become a Europeanized woman. A backup plan to study in the colonial capital of Batavia likewise came to naught with a sudden announcement in mid-1903 that her father arranged for her to be married to a much older and polygamous man of her social class. Kartini was devastated. Quote, "My crown has fallen from my head. My golden illusions of purity and chastity lie shattered in the dust. Now I am nothing more than the rest." End quote. Although Kartini felt she was, quote, "done with all personal happenings," end quote, she deserved to make her marriage a model for the future, actually meeting her husband and before the wedding and extracting from him a written promise that she could continue with her plans to create a school for girls. But she soon became pregnant, and 4 days after the birth of her son in 1904, she died at the age of 25. As her writings subsequently became known in Indonesia, Kartini came to be regarded as a pioneer of both feminist and nationalist thinking, and a number of Kartini schools were established in her memory. All right. An English cartoon on revolutionary violence, Hell Broke Loose, or The Murder of Louis, 1793. So over time, the French Revolution became more radical and violent, culminating in the Reign of Terror, which was 1793 to 1794, during which thousands of political opponents of the revolutionary regime were executed. An important step into this descent into violence was the execution of Louis XVI in January of 1793. This is source 16.3, where a British political cartoon conveys a highly critical, indeed horrified outlook on the violence that accompanied the French Revolution. It's captioned "Hell Broke Loose," as it depicts the execution of Louis XVI and was printed shortly after his death. The demonic figures in the image are repeating popular slogans of the revolution. "Vive la nation," "Long live the nation," and "We will win." And the last one here, source 16.5, Imagining Women's Suffrage, an Inauguration of the Future, 1897. Echoes of the Atlantic revolutions, including abolitionism and feminism, also had their opponents. Critics frequently made their cases against the movements by imagining a world that might be created if groups like the suffragettes won the rights that they sought. In this 1897 cartoon entitled, quote, "An Inauguration of the Future," end quote, the artist offers a vision of what America would become if women were granted the right to vote. It depicts the inauguration of a female president who is surrounded on the stage by other women in positions of power. To the bottom right, on the sidelines in the inauguration, a man is depicted in a distinctly domestic role holding a crying baby. And that concludes our study of Echoes of Revolution. I will see you guys next time.